Duba of the University of Fribourg. As is well known, Duba is an excellent scholar in the field of medieval studies, and he is also a digital humanist. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ota, for the wonderful welcome and invitation here to come to Prague. It's good to see you again after a few years. Thanks also to Hannah for the fine organization. I mentioned here one of the promises and challenges, and as you can probably read in the abstract, I was talking a lot about the future. And so, of course, I wanted to start there with the past, a bit from a digital humanities project perspective, how Fragmentarium was born from the work of digital librarians and how it's served well and not so well, fragmentology, and what we can learn and do about that for the future. So one thing that pretty much librarians have encountered for quite a long time is cases of the fine manuscript like this one. And this is from Manuscriptorium, and they'll find in the binding of their nice philosophical text something that's very different. Nice little fragment. In this case, this is what has been identified, if you go to the Manuscriptorium site, as a 9th century sacramentarium. And we've seen fragments in bindings for quite a while, and we've been wanting to do some work with them. But in terms of using fragments for research projects, there's been some serious barriers and problems, and I'll just get to a few of those. This, by the way, is a fragment that Michael Sabin put on Twitter for last Fragment Friday. And here is often what you get from a binding fragment. Here's a piece of something, looks kind of 14th century to me, and it has no beginning and no end. And it seems to be a treatise on what would be the Articles of Faith or something. And now the problem comes up for the traditional problem for those of us who work with manuscripts is that it takes a bit of work to figure out what this is. Normally, when we have a new text, we go look at the incipit, and the incipit tells us what it is, and then we make the identification. We're happy to go on to the next text in the manuscript. With this, we have neither beginning nor end, and it's been historically a pain to identify these. And still haven't quite identified this one. I can tell you what it's not. It's not Francis Meyronus, and it's not Giles of Rome. It's certainly not Thomas, but it's somebody else, somebody you might know. So one of the traditional barriers has been that. The other traditional barrier is to basically convince people that in funding agencies that this is worth studying. And you know, this was happening, you know, in the early noughties when there'd be project and being told that no, they do not, the national funding agency there does not support them because fragments take way too much time for too little reward. Much better to work with manuscripts. So part of the problem is convincing funding agencies that now with all the technology we have, it's cheaper to photograph two sides of a fragment than it is to digitize a whole book. And it's very easy now with text, well, not super easy because still don't know what this one is, but with our textual databases to make these identifications. So the previous challenges have now become advantages. And to be honest, fragmentologists have known us for a while. The question is, well, how does this become a convincing case to get funded? What happens is, in our case, is that digital libraries have existed since the internet has gone public. That is, medieval manuscripts have been shown, or images thereof, and this is the one I always trot out because it's the only one I have left from 1994. This is a Bodleian digitization for that epoch, and those of you who are very good in reading will figure out, and this is my old joke, it is a treatise on fundamental medicine. What happens is digital libraries come to this realization, and in Fribourg, Christoph Flügler has a project known as e-Codices, which makes some pretty important contributions to the science of digital libraries, both in terms of scientific photography and pairing that with high quality metadata and scientific descriptions. So you get your whole manuscript description together with the images, all in really high quality. and made quite an impact. And so when he heard a bit about the problems of fragments, he got the idea to use his experience and the base of expertise in with medieval manuscripts and digital libraries to make something for fragments. So what he does, and this is something I was not at this meeting, but there are people who are virtually present who were, is he calls an organized meeting in Geneva in 2014, and there are some major groups that he gets together. Well, first of all, you get the eCodices team. So there's Christoph Flüler, and then this is all the people who are working in eCodices. You've got major researchers. There's Lisa Fagan-Davis. We have in the back, you can see Torsten Schassen, who does the metadata stuff. We have many others. We have librarians, Christoph Macker's up there. And we even have a collector. This is Martin Schoyen there. So he brings together important manuscript librarians, important scholars in fragmentology, important scholars in digital humanities, and the eCodices crew, and they get together to talk about building something for fragments. And so they do this at you can see in the background, that's the foundation Martin Bodmer, and that's an eCodices partner as well. So in their meeting, one of the core ideas that Professor Flüler has is the idea of fragments like a panini book. And so I happen to get that up there. And the idea is, well, okay, you find these pieces like that piece here in Prague, that 9th century. Well, there's a couple of other bindings with other pieces from the same manuscript. So you can imagine taking those images digitally and putting them all together and filling out the holes of your missing book. And so this was one of the ideas that was discussed and presented there as something that you can do digitally now. Of course, it takes more than just scientific presentations. You have to have scientific discussions, and it really, really helps to have very nice Geneva restaurants with, fine meals and fine wines and all that. So I heard it was a legendary meeting, and they were still talking about it years later. What does that mean for this Panini idea, and how is it going to be implemented? Well, there's a principal weapon, which we already mentioned, which is eCodices. And at this period, the meeting was 2014, early 2014, is when eCodices web application 2.0 is being developed. So there's a new piece of software coming up here to make eCodices more powerful, and in particular, more interoperable. They're bringing in new technologies, such as the International Image Interoperability Framework. eCodices is one of the first, they claim the first digital library to use IIIF. And this is a technology that basically allows for images to be shared across the internet. So if you go on another site like the Gallica or Europeana, and you look at a Swiss manuscript, what happens in that case is via IIIF, you'll get the frame and the website of Europeana Gallica, but the images will be streamed directly from eCodices. And that's all due to this simple technology that allows for sharing. For fragments, that's particularly interesting because if you've got a book like this one in Manuscriptorium, which appears to use IIIF, if you have a book there, you have a binding fragments. And if we want to put just the fragments together in our Panini book, we can use this technology to get just those images and leave the rest of the book in Prague. So the idea was to combine with IIIF with some other simple interoperable technologies. The TEI is simply the specification for writing a standard machine readable format of texts, and there's a section of it for manuscript descriptions. So it's basically a set of rules for encoding it. For us, what's interesting, a description of a manuscript. And this isn't terribly important, but it means that everything can be done the same way, and therefore we can take one description from somewhere on the internet and publish it, automatically formatting it. That's the theory. And then of course, Creative Commons is extremely useful because when you publish images and texts with a common license, that means that we can now reuse that material immediately. So that when I spot a fragment that is published at the Bavarian State Library, for example, I can look at the license, determine that I can reuse it, and then immediately publish it, and so I can republish fragments or put my discoveries up in a matter of minutes. And this is extremely powerful and extremely fun. Brief history now of how this Fragmentarium project works with these technologies. In June of 2015 is when they get funding for this project, and it officially starts and the planning starts. You will note that I'm not there. I only start October 1st, 2016, so I'm not there at the beginning of the project. And on the 1st of September, we deploy the website, we launch it. 2019, we have a follow-on project, which was supposed to last through this year. We launch in September 2017, and part of the idea of making Fragmentarium was that the web application could be built on top of the eCodices one. We already had this software. It could be parts of it rewritten and reused. The theory was also that money would be saved because further features could be added to both at half the price. In fact, it's twice the price, but that's another story. So you can look at the CMS entry, for example, for Fragmentarium on the left and eCodices on the right, and they're very similar. There are some differences between them. Chiefly, if you look at the bottom, it's got German, English, French, and Italian. So all these fields and metadata have to be filled in the 4 languages, whereas in Fragmentarium it's just English. A few things are a little different, like a few words, like number of fragment items. There's a type, document type, which is unique to Fragmentarium. You can have fragments or reconstructions or whatever else. And then things like, for some reason, there's 2 date fields and only 1 thing in eCodices. There used to be 4 in Fragmentarium before we launched, so it's an improvement. Okay, the other big novel feature was this massive description module. And what this is in eCodices, when you have a manuscript description, the way that's done is the description is written out as a scientific description. It's then encoded by either a student assistant or one of the editors. And that means that they bring up oxygen and they enter in the XML using the templates and everything else. So they can do a lot directly in the format. To make Fragmentarium more accessible to smaller collections, the idea was to have one big form that could cover a lot of cases, again, based on digital libraries and books. So each of these sub boxes there has many fields and subfields and the rest. And the idea would be that then it could be converted into XML automatically and look something like what eCodices does. The other central element was to bring in a lot of collaborations, that is, work with institutions and projects and the rest. So you can see here, there's a mention, and we'll mention it later, there's a bunch of partners to the project, and there's a series of case studies that are launched with, in these cases, they're already designed to be early career researchers paired with a senior scholar. And you'll look at these, you can see that they try to cover a range of case studies for fragments. And again, they're basically all fragments in libraries. We also have our set of meetings and workshops to help to build the community this way. Now, to tie it all together, to really sell this point, it helps to have a very simple and easily processed idea. And so Christoph Fluder came up with the idea of calling it Fragmentology. That's the idea behind it, the study of fragments. Now, the term fragmentology has its own background. This is a 1984 article where Mundo says, "Far be it from me to make of these observations a new branch of catechology that we call fragmentology," because according to him, fragmentology is just catechology. It's just a study of books. And I mean, the next year, I think Dragos Kalma pointed this out to me in 1985. Somebody actually does use the word fragmentology to talk about fragments as a skill of study. But it's not a common term, and attaching the idea of fragmentology to this project really helps it sell. So let's go ahead and summarize what the strategy was for funding, since we're all looking for money in the world, at least to pursue our academic interests. The strategy for Fragmentarium originally was a sort of a top-down politics. You get together the leaders in the field, the big names, the people that are very impressive paper, and you wine and dine them, talk about fragments, develop some ideas in your proposal, you have 15 letters from these people, and it looks really, really good. The sources, again, these are digital libraries who are discovering fragments, so to speak. They're looking at libraries, fragments in libraries, and predominantly Latin fragments because we're Latin paleographers predominantly. The platform is being optimized for functionality, ease of use, and that term fragmentology is a big selling point. So let's get on to a bit of the results, as it were. If you go to the Fragmentarium website, you'll see that we have a list of founding partners and project partners. More or less, the founding partners were among the representatives at this meeting in Geneva, and the project partners are those who are involved later. Now, it's not entirely true. I think some of the founding partners were added in later as well. We currently have on the system, if you go to Fragmentarium, you'll see 2,854 published documents. Those are mostly fragments. There are also reconstructions in there. And there's another on the back end, the part you can't see, the other part of the iceberg is 3,336 unpublished. And about 3,000 of those are actual fragments that will see the light of day on our system. There's a whole like 4-year DFG research project that hasn't published its results yet. And so there's lots of exciting things out there. You also see that we have a nice, shiny new, well, new as of 2 years ago, web design. So it's all very attractive and professionally done. There's also as the journal, and we launched this journal in 2018 to sell exactly the idea of fragmentology as a discipline. And so, you know, this is what's been produced. Now let's talk a bit about the lessons that are learned. First of all, let's talk about just the structure of partners versus what's out there. Now, I just did this little set of pie graphs, having some fun with the published fragments. And the key detail here is that you've got the top of the screen right, you have the founding partners, and bottom right is the project partners. And if you look at that, you can see that founding partners is a pretty big chunk, partner projects are next. And then, well, there's also the internally codices things. And I have a special section there for Lisa Fagan-Davis because there's a whole, just, it's easiest to classify that way. I think some of the Contus's fragments might have snuck into that one, but you'll see that basically the partners are doing a lot when you first look at it. Now, when I take that again and just separate out the projects for Vienna and Leipzig, and for Vienna and Leipzig, we had a very talented fellow, Ivana Dobcheva. She worked at Leipzig and then went to Vienna and went back to Leipzig. And she was working there in Leipzig with Christoph Mackert and Katrin Sturm. And in Vienna, she had Katrina Kaska. So she had a lot of support and she's very talented. And you can see that when you take out Leipzig and Vienna, and then Lisa Fagan-Davis, the other founding partners are fairly few. I mean, a lot of these founding institutions are not huge contributors. And that leads to a couple of questions of why that's the case. One of the reasons is obviously it's not simply a matter of numbers. There's a few other, we'll get to in a minute here. I mean, I just say it's not a matter of numbers. Part of the issue is also that our web application was not developed to support all of the use cases of those founding partners. And a lot of these founding partners were there for their technical expertise. So, and they did provide enormous feedback on the construction of the web application. So now let's go ahead and just look at the totals, including unpublished fragments, and we get a good Pareto division of about 80-20% in terms of the number of documents and the number of contributing projects. So here, for example, the top 13 projects, and there's about 100 different contributors in our system, I think, maybe 60. But you can see that in terms of them, top 20% there contributes 80% of the fragments, and the net itself, about 80% of all the fragments are from these 13 biggest projects. This is the recent fellowship directed by Paulina Pluja-Zuk on fragments in Teutonic Prussia. This was a case study that hasn't been published. This is Sabina Filippi bone fragments in Trier, which then Laura Albiero and I did a quick revision on. This is the fragments from the Bernberger Bibliothek by Jacques Bongar that were published in eCodices by Marina Bernasconi and Brigitte Roux, and then I had to port them for the most part to Fragmentarium. Here's Lisa, there's Claudia Sawyer and Jan, if I'm not mistaken, who did Claudia's project in Stums, Viviane Kleinlicher. So those two were also responsible for the Tyrol library. Leipzig, again, that's mostly Ivana Dobcheva. Paris is Laura Albiero's project. This is a big group of medieval manuscripts and Flemish collections. Vienna, again, is Katerina Kaska and Dobcheva. It's our stuff we do internally with our team. Lots of people involved with that. And then those are all the big one there at the end are the musical fragments in the Württemberg archives directed by Stefan Morent. Finally, we mentioned archives. And that's part of the conclusions here is that we have in our system, 40% of the documents are from archives and not libraries. And if you look at our partners, there are no archives in there. There's a couple of partner projects that involve archives. But basically, this was something that's not too surprising for us as fragmentologists. My first fragment that I had to deal with for my master's was in Paris Archives Nationales AB 1734. And that will be this topic of Alexis Duchamp's paper at the end of the week here in the workshop run by Goodison at the Irish Tea. So hope you can all hear that. And since then, and Italians know quite well that there are lots and lots of fragments in archives. But digital libraries, medieval libraries, had the technology, and this is where fragmentarium comes from. So as we're discovering, there's lots of fun fragments in other places. We have a fragmentarium video conference on this by Jean-Philippe Echard, who is the conservator at the Musée de la Musique in Paris on fragments in musical instruments. And he also has a good article with Laura Albiero in the latest issue of Fragmentology, where they take apart this Stradivarius. This is their Stradivarius, and they stuck an endoscope down it and got bits of a Book of Hours, 15th century use of Rome, which they could then reconstruct. And then they got a couple of Stradivarius guitars from the same period, the 1680s, and again, give an endoscopy, and turns out that the same manuscript is used there as well. We're finding fragments in a variety of places. When we started this project, looking at fragments, they were expecting to find things like this, which is the Ossaspiel of Muri used as a book binding. And in places like this, St. Gall, and you do find fragments there. But we've also found other kinds of fragments, like these guys. The one on the left, that's a print fragment. Early print is also used in bindings of books and can be also a valid subject for fragmentological investigation. The one on the right there is just to show you that that is a 7th century fragment that Peter Boelens in Leuven found a few weeks ago, just surfing the internet. He goes through and looks at medieval manuscripts that have been digitized, but do not have thorough descriptions, and finds fragments. And somehow this 7th century fragment eluded generations of catalogers and photographers to make it out on the net. So discoveries are right in front of you. We also found another case. We find charters. This is a papal bull, and we find them as part of bindings as well. So expecting to find books, we shouldn't be ignoring other important sources for historical and handwritten sources. And then another group of things we find is ephemera. This one for you guys. This is from Leipzig. And this is one that Ivana Dobcheva worked on back in nearly 6 years ago. And it's under the master, I think it's what, Seifrido Litzig, the Nuremberg. So somebody from Nuremberg. It's Kilian Pfluger de Winsheim, Licentiatus in Artibus, Licentiatus in Arts. Today, at the second hour, will incept in arts, and the question which he will determine is this one. Utrum primum rerum principium quod per essentiam est existens omnicarens or omnicarens compositioni conformiter et immediate singula sit producens et qualibet expense multiplicationi. But we'll find out. This is ephemera. We don't have these very often. The little slip inviting you to a disputation or inception speech. And we're finding them in other places. And this is going out to Leonardo Constantini, who's been working in Gubbio in the archives there, and it has a project where they're finding all kinds of fun things in the archives and putting on Fragmentarium. You know, the basic rules: fragments are at risk. We'd like to reconstruct, rebuild not just individual pages or, you know, but entire books, and then from books, libraries, and libraries, literary culture. If you look at what they're doing in Scandinavia, there's a lot of fun work that's been done for over a century on that. And another major aspect of doing research in fragments is the moment of fragmentation. That is, when this book or whatever it is ends up being reused. And that tells us a lot. We learn a lot, but by how people reuse or throw things away as we do from when they use them. So you learn when things go obsolete, how fragmentation occurs. When fragments get put in other things like book bindings, you establish a double relationship there between these two elements. All fun things to look at. So, all right, that's basically the first part, is some observations on where things have been, some things about what we found about fragments, and now let's talk a little bit about the web application. First off, let's look at this. This is it, yeah. So this is, I just clicked on this and it should be loading. Well, and part of what I wanted to show you is that this is Lisa Fagan-Davis's Beauvais missile, where she tries to, what she does, she brings together these leaves from a missile that have been scattered pretty much around the world into a single document. Now, part of why I wanted to show this is, you're not seeing it, so, or are you seeing it? Yeah, I guess you are. Are you seeing this blank page at the moment? There it is. Did that come up? No, you guys are not. Yeah, you got that. Okay. So you see it comes up, and the reason why it took so long is because you go down here and you can see her Panini book is pretty well filled. And so this points to things that, yes, it's a success. We've done that. And you can now go look at this and read through it. On the other hand, some of you with the digital humanities experience might be saying, yeah, it took an awful long time to load, didn't it? So we have some optimization issues with the technology. And that's something else I wanted to use to underscore that. With the extreme cases, it's a little bit of a challenge. So, okay, so that's a big feature that made it. What things didn't make it? Real quickly to show you what didn't happen. There was three things: the fragment assembly tool, image comparison tool, and measurement tool. There was a whole bunch of other cool tools that we wanted to have. So basically, the idea behind this fragment assembly tool, and this was something that was already dead before I got to Fribourg, was that you have fragments like this thing that's thought to be a missile or a lectionary from Vienna. And in this case, it's a bunch of strips that were taken out of a book. They're protecting the binding, the individual paper acquires of a book several decades ago. And you can see by it, it's not a lot to go by. And the hope was to have a tool where you could take all that apart and put it together again. And so this didn't make it. And the reason why it didn't make it is because we have a tool. It's called Photoshop. And so this is what I did here. This was on my summer vacation a couple of years ago. What you do is, in this case, is you use a search on the biblical passages, since this is a, it's probably a lectionary, but it has biblical readings. So you find the biblical passages just by typing in a few words on each line, throw it into the right search engine with the wildcards, you get the match for the passage, and now you know where things fit relatively. And then using Photoshop, you can, thanks to the dark background, you can isolate the text off the background, select each individual piece, make a little layer, and then move them together like puzzle pieces. So that's the fun of this. That's why that did not make it. Because why spend a lot of money on doing something that that is done much better by tools that are even free? Okay, so let's move on to the image comparison tool and measurement tool. Now, again, there are tools that are out there, and we just need a guide to using them. Now, I'll just use this case here. I'm not going to go too much detail. Basically, the problem is this. Well, you want to compare two fragments and see if they're the same fragments. Can we get them on the same screen? Well, yes, you can do that, and you can write a lot of code to do that. Or you can just open two windows, or you can use other fancy tools out there for this. Regarding the measurements, this was a more complicated issue. There's no way to automatically measure things, photographs, no easy way. This is why we want rulers on pages. When you have a ruler on a page with a photograph, you can measure the ruler and you can get an idea of the scale and then measure it that way. There's a whole science to doing that. It's quite simple. But we often end up with things like this, which are not at all, they have no reference. So how do we know how big this is? Now, in this case, this is a forgery. And if you look at our article that we did, Christoph Flüler and I did back in 2018, you'll see that we say it's 200 millimeters long and 139 millimeters wide. Now, this was a forgery that was emailed to Professor Flüler, and the image of it was emailed to him. And we didn't really want to ask the person what the dimensions were. So how did we get those dimensions? Well, what I blacked out here, and this issue has been long resolved, so I'm only telling it now, is that this photograph was originally against a folder that had holes in it to be plugged into a binder. And so by measuring the distance between those holes, we get an approximate idea of the actual size of the fragment. So in this case, the fake. And we've got the more on the site there as far as image comparison goes. Once you have this, we know it's a fake because it is a the text is a laser printer copy of a eCodices leaf. So basically, someone downloaded a picture from eCodices, used a filter to just get the text, and then put the text on a blank piece of parchment, and then added in this fake ass initial there. And why is it a fake ass initial? Because this is the Epistola ad Paulinum. So as you all know, this is what serves as Jerome's preface to the Bible. It begins with the word, with Frater Ambrosius, and our initial there is no longer an F, but an A. And Jerome is no longer with a mitre, but he's a Franciscan. So yeah, you can see there's all kinds of comparison tools to play with on our page, on the article for this, but we'll just move on. What are some of the limitations that we have with the web application? And this gets back to why some of these big partners didn't get such big data in there. The first one is what I call the big red button problem, which is that people have large amounts of data, or they have whatever they want, and they just want a button to press that makes it all work. And I reviewed, preparing for this, some of the discussions in the early days, and some of these larger partners said, we have all this data, we don't want to re-enter it again, we just want to have a way to do this. And the proposed implementations of that were not, well, it was a problem we're still fighting with. Scaling is one. The system was designed for eCodices, which has something like 2,500 manuscripts in it. We have, as you saw, over 6,000, and we're doing things with IIIF that other people are not used to doing, like with Lisa Fagan-Davis's Beauvais Missile, where you go to that page and some of those images are coming from Fribourg or wherever our servers are, and some of them are coming from all over the world, and they all have to show up before you can look at your Panini set, and that can take some time. So we have some technological issues as well. But I think the big issue, looking back at the way it was designed, was that functionality was really being aimed for more than data. And I'll just try to explain this briefly. And that's when you take eCodices, when they built at this just before Fragmentarian, they built eCodices 2.0. The way eCodices was set up was you have a workflow where the photographers take pictures and they convert them, and then they're brought in to the server and they're placed on the server. And then there's archives. There's a whole nice workflow for that. but that's all in standardized formats. And you have a IIIF manifest that is developed, generated is very clear. And then you have a description that is encoded and put in this standard TEI format that's done by these people sitting with specialized software, and they put that up. And then at that moment, when all the data is ready, this eCodices application puts it all together, something you can see and share and other people can download and access. In Fragmentarium, what's going on is people connect to the system and they upload into the system now the images. So no longer is it going through a separate system, it's now integrated as part of this CMS. And the descriptions, they're no longer preparing the standard format, they're rather putting directly into a table. And the same for, there's additional bits of data that are thrown in as well. And to make it clear what I'm trying to get at here, when we have eCodices, you have basically images, IIIF manifests, and descriptions, basic standard data that is all out there, all very clear, and all accessible. Then it is taken by the system and indexed for search. With Fragmentarium, it's put into a system that is indexed, that is designed for search, and only afterwards is this data exported into something looking like the standardized XML and the rest. And what that boils down to for us in frank terms is that I can describe eCodices for you that way. There's these files that are description files, there are files that are image files, and there are files that are a bit of metadata. In Fragmentarium, we have my SQL database map for it, and I call this the Rat King. So this is where all the data is stored, and that also means in order to pull out a fragment description, you need to parse all of this. And the more you try to make things complicated, the harder it gets. So our description module, for example, which was very expensive to develop, I just say that it costs quite a lot, and it's really cool, but it produces a cluster. It's one of these bigger clusters over here, and the result is when I want to add a field, or when I want to say, well, I'm not just describing books here, or fragments of books. I want to describe a charter. It's a whole different format to describe a charter than a book. And that's going to cost too much money to implement. So now we're sort of stuck with this system. Whereas eCodices, we've got the standardized data, and then it's just printed and published on the site. So that's the core problem with it. Well, it's a cool system. It's got this unwieldy bit to it. And so what are we going to do about it? Well, back in 2019, I tried to describe this problem. This is our Rat King on the right, and say, well, let's just, first thing to do is take all of our data that we've got in all these places, like transcriptions, and then put them into simple standardized formats. Because all you need for a fragment is the images, something that describes how the images are organized, the descriptions, and then a document with the metadata that says, this is how the whole thing works. And that's sort of where we want to go with the future. I'm trying to figure out the problems before we get the solutions, but that's what I'm aiming at. Okay, well, I see that I've gone plenty, so I will thank you very much for your attention. And
Thank you very much, Bill, for this excellent presentation. And now we have some time for discussions, remarks, notes, comments. So if there's someone here in the venue or on Zoom, raise your hand and let us know. I can't see anyone, but I have several questions, but I put them on a paper, which is fine. I mean, I was struck that there are so many projects, big project or 13 bigger project working with fragments. And so this all goes into a database, into Fragmentarium.
No.
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
If it's like that, how hard it is to get the data and metadata in the right format? Because I guess that if there are certain people with big projects, it must mean that that must be like 50 persons involved. And so how do you make it with getting the right type and form of data?
Well, that's an excellent question. And this is, all right, this is the advantage of doing it this way, is that by saying to everybody, you have to put your data and fill out this form, then everybody's data is to some degree standardized. Now, how standardized is it? Look, we have the other very basic problem, which all of us who have worked with manuscripts know quite well, and that is that there is no way that we're going to get the French, the Italians, the Germans, and the British to agree on how to describe a manuscript and what way. So we have to say, okay, there are a few fields that are very important for us, and we're going to require you to do this in a certain format. And they succeed to different degrees with that. And then the rest is fine. Here's where you take your own spirit. So the descriptions can be in any language, and they allow for long digressions and discussions of material or very short ones. The metadata is supposed to be in English, not always, but it's supposed to be. And it's designed to be succinct and more towards a controlled vocabulary. But there's a certain amount of chaos that you're going to get when you have a large group, and that's a large group collection. And that's part of what makes this project what it is. But that's also why there's the interoperability aspect, and the aspect as well that each project can have its own page, so that the projects can also develop their material to the specifications, to their own specifications, and then share that work with other related things. Because one thing that we talked about, I want to talk about and push here, was that Fragmentology and the Fragmentarium project has its origins in digital libraries, but it becomes very clear early on that fragments touch upon more than just medieval manuscript fragments. There's medieval diplomatics, there's early print material, there's ephemera, there's any number of other fields that are interested in this. And they have, so we have musicology projects, and we have, we have projects in, we have projects working in specific institutions, and we have projects looking for liturgical texts, and we have, so, and there's one thing I looked at last year was the fragments that are bound in the books currently in the Latin collection of the National Library of France for the Sorbonne. And you find that in the Bibliothèque de la Sorbonne in the Middle Ages, they used more philosophical fragments to bind their books than liturgical ones, as you often find with monastic collections. So you find bits of astronomy, text, well, of course, stuff from the city of Paris, and all kinds of other interesting bits that would otherwise not be found. So yeah, there's a diversity, and we have to embrace that as part of it. But part of the problem too, is have so many projects, is we have so few projects. The other issue that we've had politically in the structure is that people come, and told me that they see this list of partner projects, and they have the assumption that this is sort of a closed operation, and that their contributions are not necessarily welcome. And we have a mechanism at the moment to bring people in, which is largely I train or somebody else trains them to do this, but it's still, it's not as widespread as it should be. And part of that is also the governance model, which was like the foundation, very top-down and authoritarian. And we need to transition to more of a shared governance approach. We have all these stakeholders, all these people with research projects, and all their research that depends on this resource. And we need to have a system by which they have some oversight, if not control, of the platform as a whole.
No, my question is not a musicological one, but I wondered, my colleagues had this wonderful project, Fragmentum, from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Sure. I wondered if you have contacts to auction houses, because many books part the auction houses, and they have fragments on their covers, and then when we are lucky, they disappear in public libraries, or when we are less lucky, they disappear somewhere else. And with them also this very valuable material. So do you think there would be chance to collaborate also with them to just catch these fragments?
Well, that's an excellent, that's an excellent question, and something that, well, I mean, there was an idea at the beginning. You saw in that first, in that picture, the first meeting, there was Martin Skoyen was among the people, and was one of the founding partners was a Skoyen, and we never digitized his fragments, and they're now being sold off at auction. He had one of the largest fragment collections, and it would be very important, I think, to bring in what we haven't, the groups we really haven't gotten involved so much are, collectors and auction houses. Now, there's a lot of questions, of course, about what people are collecting these for and what auction houses thinks is important, because there's still out there the notion that you're giving people, when you're selling a fragment, this is a unique piece of history, which is why we collect them and why we think they're important for Fragmentarium. But a collector may also want unique control over that. And of course, there's a whole set of ethical questions with that. Are people allowed to just simply take pieces of patrimony away from collective ownership? The other side of it, of course, is with the number of fakes that are increasingly out there and the amount of the broken books, they're still dismembering manuscripts and selling them online that are in circulation. Would the provenance of having their fragment registered and published on Fragmentarium help? And that's help in terms of both legitimacy and the resale value. These are all things that can be argued, but it would be useful, but we haven't done it yet.
Just very general, small questions. Could you tell us how your definition of a fragment elaborate over the course of time, since you were giving us a lot of interesting details? And also, was there ever a discussion about the language of the descriptions? Or was it just taken for granted it's going to be English, and all the other people, they didn't say, let's do it in Latin?
Well, all right. The second question first, because it's easier. Since this is one of Christoph Flüler's core principles, is that the descriptions are scientific descriptions, and they're part of an academic record. And this is something that comes in through codices, and is a bit of a, it has a couple of interesting consequences. One of them is that in this manuscript description module of the text encoding initiative, this is developed in 2000 or so, or the last version, whatever, by librarians looking to encode their catalogs. And so the model that implies is that there is one description, if you look at the way the manuscript description module is set up, is that description is a surrogate for the manuscript. The author of the description is the author of the text in the manuscript and not the author of the description in the TEI model. So when you look at what he does at codices, is he starts putting descriptions up, encoding the ones that are printed and new ones in the language of the description. And in Fragmentarium, we've adopted that. The description can be in any language. The basic metadata, the very short bit, we prefer to be in English. So that's that. Now, the first question was the more complicated one about my definition of fragments, and I could go on for 20 to 30 minutes about this. It's something that you start with the idea of like saying, well, yeah, this is a fragment, this is in the book. And there's many different definitions out there. I have problems with all of them. So I have a threefold typology that, I go out, there's a whole 15-minute slideshow I do on that. But basically one of the core elements is the reuse, the moment of fragmentation, the idea that this thing has been recycled. And for that way you can include things like charters, because when you're doing a survey of binding fragments and you go to and this is Elizabeth Caldelli has a great catalog of the Valtelliana fragments. And in that introduction there, she says, well, I'm not doing the documentary ones, which is 20% of our collection, because they're not book fragments. They're not literary. But she also says, also because somebody else is doing it. But So they're not like, but in general, when you're doing a survey, how are you going to throw things out because you say this is documentary and this isn't? And to make that decision, you already have to analyze a text in question, and there's going to be limit cases. So I just say, I tend to be also, as an American, there's this imperialistic streak, and we like to embrace the full diversity of fragments and all their kinds, and say that yes, they can all be included under a tent in some way. Well, within limits. But yeah, you get to some edge cases, but we don't worry too much about it.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you. This is excellent. I'm a big admirer, as Lisa already knows. I just wanted to ask if there's an opportunity to bulk upload, maybe instead of using your form via a CVS document, for example, or if an institution or a person has already TEI encoded descriptions of manuscripts to match with your fields, obviously. And also wondering if there should be maybe different approaches to people in institutions when it comes to fragments in terms of whether they are found in bindings or whether they are separate leaves. Because, for example, a case in point here is my current institution, University of Kansas. We have a lot of separate leaves that have been somewhat identified, dimensions are known, and they have, so good descriptions and images, but almost none of the binding fragments that are found in the current manuscripts and print books are not, none of them almost are documented. So this is just like an open question. What are your thoughts about getting this information from researchers and institutions? Thank you.
Well, thank you again for two very good questions that allow me to underscore what I think is some of the key moments here. First is bulk upload and your Excel sheets. This is a problem, and as I mentioned, I went back and I was reading some of the meeting notes from before I showed up, and that was one of the first requests was bulk uploads. How do we've got all this data already there, how do we get it? And the answer, I mean, on the one hand to say, well, they want a big red button, that's not possible. I think the problem that was with the foundation, with the way Fragmentarium is organized, is that by requiring this set of forms, it locked everything into this database, this Rat King. So in order to get to bulk upload, in order to have a script that will take your Excel sheet and just put it into a nice XML and send that off to to our system, there are two ways to go. And one way was proposed at the beginning of, in 2018, which was let's just write an API for Fragmentarium, which is going to be difficult. That is a set of code that sits there and translates from this database, the Rat King, to the world there, and makes things available. So when you say, could you give me the description for this manuscript, it gives you the description. And you would make one first, would be read only. So you could first write something that you could first just get information out of the database and have it sent automatically. And then the next part would be the write. And then it came the price tag. And for the read-only part, it was about $120,000. And then they didn't even know if you could do the write only, and bulk upload require the write only. So it's like, okay, clearly the problem is that this massive tangled database can't be made more complicated. The solution is to kill it. All we need are descriptions. If you've got XML, why can't you just upload it? Well, because our system isn't built for that. eCodices was, but this is what was changed. So I think the answer is going to be that we convert our data that we have in the Rat King into these standard formats that we're talking about, rather than export them. We make them, convert them, and we have a front end that runs natively on them, which is what eCodices can do. So it runs directly off the IIIF manifest. I mean, we have a system that can do that, but instead it goes and asks the Rat King, when you look at an image, when you look at, for example, Lisa's Beauvais missile, instead of going to IIIF manifest and saying, okay, let's go look at this, it goes into this database, pokes around, pulls all the pieces out, and assembles in real time that, And then if you want the manifest, you press a button and it will assemble it again. So much simpler to publish manifests and publish descriptions, and then on the front end, render those into pretty looking images and text, than to build this whole complicated edifice. So that's what I think we need to do to move forward and really bring the potential of fragmentarium out. And this is also means that for things like, if I want a description of a charter that looks like a description of a charter, I can write that in XML. I don't have to spend another $100,000 on a description module. So that's where I think it's going. Now, the next issue is there a distinction between the leaves and the in situ binding fragments? Absolutely. For holding institutions, it's huge. And as you point out, in North America, as I was, we all have loose, but there are many collections of loose fragments. This is when I was in grad school, we had loose fragments at Iowa, and those were all well known, and they'd bring them all out every time. And now I go back and, Eric Ensley is looking at the in situ binding fragments that nobody had ever looked at, that had been there just as long. And we're finding new things. So I think that absolutely, this is where we have to go. And you can make these distinctions in our system.
Hi, Bill, how are you? Thank you. Thank you so much for this summary and history. It's really interesting to kind of see the big narrative and the big picture. Just a few things that I wanted to follow up on first of all, what Kibelchim just said, in that one of the things that I think is really interesting is how collections on the side of the Atlantic where Kibel and I live are so different and have such different issues and different problems than collections in Europe, in terms of the way they were developed, in terms of what you're going to find, the fact that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of in situ binding fragments that have never been imaged or described. There's so much material still to be found, and people, I think in the US at least, are finally starting to get on that and to start surveying bindings and seeing what we find. The batch upload, I think, is definitely an issue, and it was the real reason why Digital Scriptorium has been shut down and is being redesigned, because it had that same problem that people had to key their data in multiple places. You had your own institutional OPAC, but if you wanted to be part of Digital Scriptorium, you had to rekey your data and input it into Digital Scriptorium. And that's definitely a problem for long-term sustainability of any resource, because it just frustrates collections. Like you said, that I've got all this data, why can't I just push the big red button? So I think it's really important to think about how that kind of functionality can be input into Fragmentarium. And then the last thing is that I wanted to follow up a little bit on the question about private collections and auction houses, and that my own project, the Beauvais Missile project, and the projects that my library school students have worked on in Fragmentarium, we've worked with, for the Beauvais Missile, I'm dealing with more than 80 different collections that own leaves of this manuscript. Some of them are public collections, some of them are private collections, and some of the images that I have are from leaves that were sold at auction or by a book dealer and are now untraced. And those, those images are essentially, I'm using them, but with the noting when it was sold and that it's untraced. And that one of the really great things about Fragmentarium is that it allows you to make that distinction, that there is an owner category that's private collection. There's another category that's untraced. So those kind of fields become discoverable. And the records are also so easily updatable. So if something suddenly reappears that I thought was untraced, I can really easily update the descriptions. And the same for the images. Sometimes I may have a really terrible image that I scanned from a catalog, and then suddenly the owning collection might put up these beautiful new images that may even be IIIF images, and then I can update the record accordingly. So that's, I think, another really important feature. And the idea being able to work with multiple collections instead of, most of these projects that you've talked about are institutional projects, but there is this really amazing opportunity to work between institutions, which is where the real fun is of fragmentology, when you start to make those connections. So I'm really grateful to you. That's really what I wanted to say. I'm really, really grateful to you for the work that you've done on this project and making this incredible tool. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I mean, just underscore that the collaborative aspect is the most fun too. I mean, telling people that, in North America, that they don't just have their loose fragments, but there's a binding survey to be done, and then seeing that actual happen, and then the results coming out is amazing. Then talking to people, what's going on in various aspects, but linking up experts too. When you have this many people working on fragments, we have experts in a variety of types of script and types of text and particular phenomena, and that's extremely useful. The private collectors and private collections was a model for for fragmentarium at the beginning, to include them, and it's just not been one of the major areas that things have been developed yet. Now, yeah, we're hoping in the future to move away. I mean, you talk about the problem of having data in multiple places, and we even have, we have that between fragmentarium and e-codices too. One of the things I was going to show, and I had a very nice slide that's now in the lost and found baggage in Geneva, was of the XML from a Bongar's fragment published on e-codices last, a couple of years ago, and published on Fragmentarium. And you can see that here we have this really high quality description, carefully encoded in precise XML by the e-codices editors. And then for it to work in Fragmentarium, we've got to paste it all on these fields, and the result is not as nice. And it's also going to be a problem if you need to update something, then you've got to do it in 2 places, and nobody ever does that. And so, it's a huge set of issues. So yeah, we're, the way forward is going to be to have an open link data system that does not just IIIF, but for other elements like descriptions. You can point to places on the internet and bring those XML descriptions in real time. So I think that's the next iteration to build. And so, and we've got a good set of data here. That my first bit of work, I think that last slide was from 2019 is when I did that. Looking forward to finally getting around to standardizing the data now to prepare for the next set of stages.
I would have one last question. So if I got it rightly, this Red King, that's basically your data model, which includes all the various documents, which might be fragments.
Yeah. Well, technically, the Red King is a visualization of the MySQL database behind Fragmentarium's, the Fragmentarium web application. So it is a visualization of the relational database of all the tables in there. And there are tables for users and user accounts, there are tables for collections, there's tables for the whole description sections, the whole series of tables, because there are descriptions that have a big table, but in those descriptions, you can have multiple content items. So you have a subtable for that, and so on and so forth. So it is for everything. And the term Rat King, which I didn't describe, but it comes from this Central European notion that was in the 19th century of a group of rats whose tails are tied together. And whether these actually existed or not is open to debate, but you can find in various museums stuffed 19th century examples of rat kings. So, and the Rat King in the Nutcracker is also such a rat king. That's why it has 2 heads.
All right, thanks. But still, to get back to the data model, I'm just wondering if it was immediately clear how the data model will look, or if you had long discussions with your colleague about the data model. And so I'm wondering how long it took to develop this as a data model.
Well, I was fortunately not there for most of it. I can tell you from looking at the meetings, the meeting minutes, some of these meetings would go on for 8 hours, that they started with e-codices. And then the things that e-codices had as separate pieces of data, I mean, the separate files and so on, they just built tables into that. And for things like the description module, when I came, they were still debating the structure of that, and it underwent many changes and additions. And at some point, an entire rewrite was demanded. And I don't know, I don't remember that. I just, I wasn't there for that, but it was some spectacular fireworks from what I understand. So it was a very, shall we say, it was a very long and difficult process. And I mean, you can even see some of that stress from what came out. If you remember the slide I showed at the beginning here, we'll just see if I can show it really quickly. On the left here, you have 2 entries that says date from, date to, from, and from. And why are there 2? And I said, the joke was, and the joke I always tell you is, why are there 2? Because there were 4 when I got there. And why were there 4 of these things is the next question. Well, because the data model, there's a discussion about what do you do with a fragment? What do you have with a palimpsest? You want to put the upper text and lower text? And what about the extreme cases? Should I put a separate set of dates for any annotations on there? So at some point, they're throwing in, okay, well, and this feature I think costs $6,000 or something bucks to do, because it's you've got tables and tables now. And the idea was to say, okay, well, we can have 4 should be the most that anybody will ever need. Of course, the answer is that when you work through the data model, the most anyone ever needs is 1, because you have 1 fragment and you want to give 1 basic date. And if you want to describe in all the rich detail of the world, the dating of the various objects on it, you put that in the description and not in your basic metadata. The basic metadata is just there to identify the object in a relatively unambiguous way. So that's an example of the, shall I say, the long debates and reflections that went into it. And like any sort of committee work, the answer I think works. I think it works really well, but it's not without its problems and its shortcomings.
Right. So thank you so much. I guess that it's time to finish this Prague talk on digital humanities. So thanks again, Bill, for coming and joining us and for your paper.